All right, everyone, welcome to Utopia 113. Welcome back to what feels like a packed room. Uh, it's been a few years, hasn't it? Of course, the pandemic goes on. I was just sick recently, so at about 50% capacity right now. But I'm delighted that everyone is here. Thank you for coming out. And thank you, Étienne, for joining us. So in the concluding passages of her magnificent book, Critique, Norm, and Utopia, a study of the foundations of critical theory, Sheila Benhabib offers a roadmap for a new conception of utopia. In the book, Benhabib traces what she calls the demise of the philosophy of the subject. And she suggests that this demise changes the meaning of utopia in our societies. Previously, she suggests, the concept of utopia had been associated with the potential of one particular group in society, one collective singularity, one universal class. The proletariat, for instance, for Marx, or art and philosophy for the Frankfurt School. But that changed, she suggests, in the late 20th century, giving rise to what Sheila Benhabib identified as a new politics of empowerment, new social movements, a conception of difference and of the value of difference. And these new social movements formed communities, what she calls communities of need and solidarity, at the interstices of society. And of these, Benhabib writes in concluding her book, such utopia is no longer utopian, for it is not a mere beyond. It is the negation of the existent in the name of a future that bursts open the possibilities of the present. Let me say that again. It is the negation of the existent in the name of a future that bursts open the possibilities of the present. Now, that was written in the mid-1980s, published in 1986, at a time, of course, before the Berlin Wall fell. It was a very different time indeed. The Soviet Union was a superpower. The World Trade Centers were a tourist attraction. There was no war on terror, no wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, no war now in Ukraine. There wasn't a rise of neo-fascism. There was hardly an appreciation of global climate warming. So it was a different time indeed. Today, I'd say, rather than bursting open the possibilities of the present, we need to burst open the realities of the present now. We've run out of time. We've run out of time to speak of a future. We can't wait any longer. We need now to be immersed in the present and in the present of utopian projects. That is our task this year, to explore what we are calling concrete utopias, not just real utopias in the sense of articulated, formulated, well thought through blueprints of a utopian condition, but concrete utopias in the sense of really existing, functioning, already working practices, institutions, models, and exemplars of what might be called utopia. Just as I sat and arrived here, I got a copy of Gary Wilder's new book, Concrete Utopianism, The Politics of Temporality and Solidarity, which I recommend to you all, just published with Fordham University Press. And so it is a time, it seems, of concrete utopianism. Now, why return to a fraught concept like utopia you may ask, in this late stage of history in the early 21st century? And the reason, paradoxically, at least for me, is that we are all so comfortable today using the term dystopia. We can so easily identify and label aspects of our present existence as dystopic. The election in Italy just this week of a new prime minister from the party of the Brothers of Italy, an openly nationalistic, nativistic, xenophobic party, the direct descendant and heir of the National Fascist Party of the 1920s and 30s and of the Republican Fascist Party of the mid-1940s. I think we can identify that as a dystopia. This morning, the New York City Council, its Committee on Criminal Justice, held hearings on a proposed bill, Introduction 549, which would ban solitary confinement in New York City jails. Our colleague Jelani Cobb spoke to the assembled masses outside protesting solitary confinement. Solitary confinement we can call a dystopia. In fact, it's a form of heterotopia in Foucault's words, what he called a heterotopia of deviation for those in which it's a space in which individuals whose behavior is deviant in relation to the required mean or norm are placed. But we can easily, and we do, identify dystopias all around us. They're concrete dystopias, not imaginary, not possible, but actual, really existing practices and institutions that are dystopic. And that is what makes it so urgent today for us to identify really existing concrete utopian projects, because they surround us as well. We need to be focusing on them to identify and expand them, to grow them, to support them, to love them, to embrace them. It is in this sense that our Utopia 1313 project continues, in a way, the real Utopias project that Erik Olin Wright was engaged with and spearheaded, in part with Janet Gornick, Marcia Mayers, and others. And like them, our project is, in their words, a clear elaboration of workable institutional principles that could inform emancipatory alternatives to the existing world. Now, by contrast to their project, and in the book, Envisaging Real Utopias, Erik Olin Wright focuses on 9 case studies that he looks at, including universal basic income, the Mondragon Group cooperative in Spain, Wikipedia, participatory democratic budgeting in Porto Alegre in Brazil, and other things. By contrast to some of those projects, which may be real but were never realizable, or which may not reach the level of utopia, what we are trying to focus on is a subset and a larger set of projects that do surround us. The worker cooperative Mondragon Group is a remarkable case study, one that we might return to. Certainly not without its critics, but remarkable in its size and dimension, and with 74,000 workers who are part of the various cooperatives that form the Mondragon Group, revenues in the billions of euros, right? 7th largest business enterprise in Spain today, a form of a worker cooperative run through participatory democratic mechanisms by the workers themselves. We'll look in 2 weeks, we'll have with us Kali Akuno, one of the founders, co-founders of Cooperation Jackson, in an organization that has been working to put together a network of solidarity economy cooperatives in West Jackson, Mississippi, particularly hard hit, as you know, recently by the water horrors there in Mississippi. But working to create a Black self-determining, self-sufficient solidarity economy there. There are projects around the globe. Here in the Bronx, there's the Cooperative Home Care Associates, which was probably one of the largest worker cooperatives in the United States, with 17,000 persons, predominantly women of color, who are home care associates and who are running their own enterprise. Or the US Solidarity Economy Network in Belchertown, Massachusetts, or the Intercontinental Network for the Promotion of the Social Solidarity Economy in Africa and Asia, Cooperation Vermont, Cooperation Humboldt in California, agricultural cooperatives in South Africa, the New York City network of co-ops, Solidarity New York City, which came together and did so much mutual aid work in the wake of the Hurricane Sandy. Large and small, even a small local garden. Another example, perhaps, of a heterotopia, the OSS, Outer Siege Shadow Project in the Marble Hill community in the Bronx, that was started by community activist Jackie Fisher and artist Juan Lee Carrion in 2016. And it connects local communities in New York City with artists to create community gardens. They have these open calls. They create and they promote healthy food, cultural pride, community self-development. They're part of the Northwest Bronx Food Justice Coalition, right? These concrete utopias surround us. They take place all around us. And it's time to focus on those, not simply to trace the history of utopias, nor the history of what Karl Mannheim called counter-utopias, nor to delve in some imaginary, but to burst open, in Sheila Ben-Habib's words, the reality, in my words, not just the possibility, the reality of utopian elements in the present. Now, that's what we'll be doing this year. But to start us off, we have to ask how to deal with the fraught theoretical luggage of utopia, the fraught history of the term utopia itself, particularly within critical circles, right? That's our task today in this opening session. And there's no one better to help us with this task than our dear friend and colleague, the philosopher Étienne Balibar. More than anyone, Étienne Balibar has grappled with the problems of utopia and utopian thinking. Several years ago, in a chapter titled After Utopia Imagination, ? It was in a collected volume, Political Uses of Utopia, New Marxist, Anarchist, and Radical Democratic Perspectives, edited, published at Columbia University Press, 2017. You took a somewhat negative view of utopia. Utopia, you wrote, be it individualist or collectivist, traps us and the imagination within the alternatives of realism and unreality. And you embraced in that chapter, in part, the more pejorative sense of the term with which we are, of course, familiar, right? I mean, the notion of utopia as something that does not exist, as something that has not been achieved. And you argued there that, quote, it seems to me that the main problem facing us at the turn of the century consists of taking leave of utopia while setting free the powers of the imagination. Now, a few years later, here, we discussed your essay, Regulations, Insurrections, Utopias, for a Socialism of the 21st Century, which would form the conclusion of your book of collected writings, Écrit 1 en Histoire interminable. And there, I think you took a less pejorative or a less negative view of utopias, even perhaps embracing in that one. Yes. Embracing even, I think there was even a notion of concrete utopias in there. You wrote, all the preceding hypotheses, of course, this was referring to programs, regulations, insurrection, so all of the forms of utopian struggle, socialist struggle, involve, you say, a utopian dimension, not so much in the current, largely pejorative sense, evoking a future that is unattainable, but in the sense that they would go against the current of the dominant social relations. And here's the line I liked best. The essential thing is not the anticipation of the future, you wrote, but in the present, the exercise of a concrete thought of difference and of an imagination that invents counterconducts, makes a counterculture emerge following paths that branch off, Borges, experiments with alternative ways of living, of relating, and of working. Now, I was still a little bit concerned about the place of imagination rather than the really existing in that chapter. But I'm glad that now we can flesh it all out. We have collected an extraordinary set of readings for you that are online and that we hope that you've had an opportunity to read. It's really a marvelous collection with Ernst Bloch, The Spirit of Utopia, Michel Foucault's Of Other Spaces on Utopia, and Heterotopias, Fredric, Jameson, Archaeologies of the Future, The Desire Called Utopias, and Other Science Fictions. 3 manifestos, the Zapatista Army, 6th Declaration of the Selva, Lacandonia, the Alex Williams and Nick Srnicek Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics, of course, Marx and Engels' famous Communist Manifesto, and Erik Olin Wright's book on envisaging real utopia. So we've got a terrific set of material for you. I tried to organize it into 6 questions, which we shared with you all and are online. 6 questions to pose about really the relationship between utopian thinking and transformation, and how we might push the discourse of utopia in the direction of concrete utopias. Now, those are 6 challenging questions. These are urgent times. We might not be able to address them all, but we are here today to start with the theoretical groundwork with our dear friend, Étienne Balibar, the inimitable, the indefatigable, inimitable, and our longtime colleague here at Columbia.
And often interminable.
Who will speak for 20 minutes. No, I meant an hour. Okay. All right. Étienne, welcome.
I hope this is not the last time I'll be speaking in this room, but perhaps it will be.
Can you all hear? Is that loud enough? No.
Loud enough? No.
Let me see.
Hold it.
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah.
So
Always the same conflict with. So, allow me to say that this is a very special and very moving circumstance for me, and I see many friends here in the audience, known and unknown, all friends, in fact. I even see people who have already heard 2 of my talks these days, so this will be the last year. Okay, allow me to begin with a quick. Oh. Last time I spoke here, I was unable to read my text without making this kind of mistake all the time. Allow me to begin with a quick explanation of my title. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a long one. It's Uncovering Lines of Escape Towards a Concept of Concrete Utopia in the Age of Catastrophes. Some of you will have recognized the Deleuzian terminology, but perhaps you wonder why I transformed the standard translation of Deleuze's ligne de fuite from line of flight, which is the standard translation apparently, into line of escape. In fact, the translators hesitated, and there's a note at the beginning of the English edition of A Southern Plateau that you can look at if you like. I was attracted to the Deleuzian formulation by the very ambivalence of the French expression ligne de fuite, that escape, it seems to me, would indicate perhaps better than flight. This ambivalence or dilemma lies at the heart of many uses of the word or category utopia, and you already recall that. Perhaps it was already there in the moment of its invention, in the name of the imaginary island harboring a perfect society that was described by Thomas More in his book from 1516. Interesting coincidence, the same year as Machiavelli's The Prince, often presented as its polar opposite, although somebody like Gramsci mixed both ideas, calling The Prince a revolutionary utopian manifesto. It is indeed plainly visible in the opposition of judgments that either critically reject certain political programs or visions of the future as utopian, or explain that there can be no genuine emancipatory politics without an essential component of, I borrowed the formula from Miguel Abensour, unfortunately not translated, I'm afraid, into English, but one of the greatest French scholars working on Utopia, an essential component of utopian conversion. Things become more interesting and more complicated at the same time when we observe that, for example, the Marxian reading of Socialist and Communist Utopias, chapter 3 of the Manifesto, with its characteristic combination of admiration for the bold imagination of an alternative to capitalism proposed in the works of the great utopian socialists, and radical critique of their alleged apolitical character, has been largely replaced today by the idea that of all the great socialists of the 19th century, Marx is probably the most utopian of all, because of his transcendental idea of a radical change or transformation of the social world, as opposed to any partial reform or evolution. This is deemed to be properly the impossible, with often the correlative idea that if you try to force the impossible into the real, you generate horrors and catastrophes, as contemporary history would have proved. But it remains also invoked as the symbol of a connection deemed necessary between such ideas as emancipation, revolution, totality or world, and a complete reversal of the existing order of things. So the opposite values that are called by the category utopia never remain neatly separated, applied to different objects or practices, or vindicated by opposite camps. They signal the ambivalence of certain modalities which take the form of anticipations. Now, it seems to me that in order to examine the contents of what contemporary discourses and programs offer us in terms of concrete utopias, that is, alternatives to the capitalist system with its forms of exploitation and domination, sometimes also its exterminist consequences, and I'll return to this, and in order to assess at the same time their viability and their radicality, we need to take into account another preliminary obstacle, perhaps a fundamental objection, which has to do with the kind of imaginary of the future that is linked to the very notion of utopia, or a utopian program in our intellectual tradition. And already with the quotation of Sheila Ben Habib, of course, you indicated that this might be outdated, but nevertheless, we must return to this at least for a moment. Can you follow me? Is that okay? Yes. Very abstractly, we could put it in the following manner. Utopias are blueprints for a better future, or in the words made famous by the book published between 1944 and 1959 by Ernst Bloch, they emanate from the assertion of a principle of hope. The extracts that are on the website are from the first book, The Spirit of Utopia, 1918, which in a sense is the root of all that. And then, of course, the later book is much more developed and huge. When I selected the passages, I couldn't find, in fact, I didn't have the library I needed, the scanner, etc. So I couldn't find the possibility to extract a chapter from the principle of hope. But perhaps that can be added retrospectively. So, and they express at the same time the substance of that hope, which is negatively the liberation from evil or from a bad life, and positively happiness or autonomy or human dignity. And the forms of consciousness combining desire and will that anticipate the better future or allow us to construct it. But this makes sense only if objectively and subjectively we can assume that there is a future in the strong sense of the term, meaning a future that is not just a continuation or the repetition of the present, a mere succession of similar moments or ages. However, there are different ways to try and overcome the nihilistic objection that plagiarizing a formula once used by Marx with respect to history, there existed once a future, but there is no longer one. Bloch himself uses a speculative argument based on the idea that the openness of the future, together with its correlatives, the radical incompleteness or insufficiency of the present, and the inner tension, the drive or pulsion, Trieb in German, same word as in Freud, which pushes time itself towards the invention of the future from within the incompleteness of the past, are, this Bloch's vision, intrinsically linked to our experience of life itself and to our condition as living beings who are not only minds, intellects, but also and primarily bodies. So the abolition of the future, the horizon of expectation within which utopias locate their representation of a different life and the effects that drive them, would mean that life itself is terminated. It would mean that we are dead. It is the experience of life that generates the representation of time, not the representation of time that determines the power to live. However troubled and even tragic the latter can be. But this is very abstract reasoning. It's a beautiful reasoning, but it's a very abstract reasoning, apparently timeless, which in fact relies on categories elaborated in a certain philosophical and cultural framework. It has clear theological roots, since it represents in particular a secularized version of the Jewish-Christian idea of creation, or the continuous creation and recreation of the world with its immanent temporality. But above all, it reveals the intrinsic relations that the classical utopian narratives established with the modern philosophies of history, whose central category and also permanent problem was progress. These relations admittedly are very complex. They exhibit many modalities and varieties, and it is not my object tonight to explore them in detail. But I can't leave them completely aside, because there is a possibility that the contemporary situation in the world exhibits what, in terms borrowed from Günther Anders, to whom I will return, we could call the obsolescence or the outdatedness of the idea of progress. This is not simply, excuse me, French, horrible French accent, the feeling that there is no progress, or there is regression instead of progress. And you were mentioning the dystopias, current dystopias in this sense. It is not even the idea that in such and such domain of life, work or government, progress appears unlikely or right away impossible. but it is the idea that progress in general, as the substantial content of time, has become meaningless, an empty conventional idea. If it can be argued that the utopian spirit has an intrinsic connection to the broad notion of progress, which was inseparable from the representations of history and collective action in Western modernity, either as one of its illustrations or as a counterpart to its perceived limitations, then the obsolescence of the idea of progress also entails that the utopian way of thinking has become obsolete, unless it is completely redefined, which I believe to understand is one of the objectives of this seminar. Reinhard Koselleck's argument about the past, the future's past, representations of the future that in fact belong entirely to the past, could be reformulated in the following manner. Modernity, especially after the great turning point marked by the civilizational changes that resulted from the British Industrial Revolution and the French-American Democratic Revolutions, entirely organized its vision of time and history around the axiomatic justification of the idea of progress, not as an article of faith or a belief, but as a transcendental condition of possibility of history or historicity itself. Utopias on this basis appear as a radical implementation or as alternatives to the dominant ways of implementing progress. But again, if progress itself loses its inevitability, even its intelligibility, then utopias have no ground on which to construct themselves. They become just as archaeological as the myth of the ancient civilizations. They can still be admired and contemplated as aesthetic fictions, but not reactivated or reinvented as anticipations, as active imaginations of new ways of life, as a social practice to be initiated. But is this the case? I mean, is it the case that we no longer live in the horizon of progress? And if that is the case, in which modality exactly? A universal statement with a totalitarian character like this could be very misleading here, since it runs the risk of transforming what ought to be an interpretation rooted in careful descriptions of the actual world we live in into a kind of prophetic revelation about the end of history as we knew it. Allow me to try and make what could be a relatively long discussion as short, as brief as possible. I have essentially 2 points. First, albeit utopias can relate to the idea of progress in a variety of modes, which are consistent with the polysemy of this idea itself, it is with the conviction that progress also means catastrophe that the utopian intention, a contrario, acquired its compelling character. Second, although we have a strong and very anxious feeling that we live today in a context of imminent catastrophes which threaten our lives and liberties, deriving from the extreme developments of an unbound capitalism, the major catastrophes that we are concerned with seem to involve a condition of impossibility for the formulation and implementation of utopian projects. This is at the same time a paradox and an embarrassment. We seem to be caught in a circle. Allow me to elaborate a little bit on this. If we limit ourselves to what I would call the modern utopias, the post-revolutionary utopias of the 19th and 20th century, it seems that they can become related to the grand narrative of progress, which presents the history of development of human institutions as a continuous transition from imperfection to greater perfection, in pretty much the same manner in which generally political ideologies have reacted to this notion, which had become, so to speak, naturalized in in Western modernity, including and perhaps above all, the history of colonization. That is to say, they present themselves either in the modality of additional progress, utopias as more progress, or in the modality of withdrawal from the line of progress, resisting, as it were, its alleged necessity, or in the modality of a deviation with respect to the line of progress, opening the possibility of a bifurcation in the realization of the objectives of modernity, both in terms of material goods, prosperity, welfare, and in terms of moral values, freedom, and equality. The possible world which they delineate or try and bring to actuality is either a world that accelerates progress in its visible course, or which tries to neutralize and reverse some of its destructive effects, particularly the destruction of sentiments, communitarian bonds, interpersonal solidarities resulting from the general commodification of life and the rigid division of labor, or which tries to invent another modality of shaping the human, particularly in the form of new modes of education. Education is a great field of development and justification of the utopian thought. This is not to say that these modalities remain totally separated from one another. On the contrary, they are quite regularly offering combinations of these different attitudes. For instance, a combination of the idea of technological progress and even financial innovation in the Saint-Simonians with the idea of a religious revival, a resistance to the secularism of European modernity, as you can see in the doctrines and practices of the Saint-Simonians again. Ultimately, I believe that this is due to the fact that the key issue at stake in utopian imagination, especially the socialist utopias, is a quest for the retrieval or the replacement of the lost community, or the equivalent of the social relations that modern individualism based on the absolute privilege of private property has destroyed. But at this point, I believe that we must introduce an additional phenomenological character which brings in the theme of catastrophe. If we have in mind the etymological meaning, a catastrophe in Greek is a turning upside down of the institutional or the natural, as well as its common uses, we could say that utopias are catastrophes against a catastrophe, or they tend to turn the world upside down to avoid its destruction. This is inspired to me by the reading, among others, of a book published some time ago by our friend and colleague Susan Buckmorse, which I strongly recommend, another addition to our bibliography, Dream World and Catastrophe, The Passing of Mass Utopia in East and West from 2000. Buckmorse draws inspiration from her familiarity, her great familiarity with the work of Walter Benjamin, who himself proposed a messianic interpretation of the discourse of 19th century socialist and bourgeois utopianism. What I believe we can draw from these references is the idea that utopias are not just modulations of the idea of progress with diverging orientations towards the future, towards the past, and so on. They incarnate an intrinsic excess with respect to progress, or they invent, illustrate, schematize, as philosophers would say, an opening of the limits of the possible, beyond the limitations that are observable in the real, that is, the dominant social relations, which itself can be interpreted as a reaction against the catastrophic destruction of these possibilities. This was true as well on the side of the political catastrophes when the egalitarian ideals of the democratic revolutions became transformed into an increasingly hierarchic and discriminating social order, And one should think here, in particular, of the crushing of the hopes of emancipation of women from the old domestic order prompted by the modern revolutions, which in reaction leads to the strong feminist component of romantic utopias. And on the side of the catastrophic effects of the Industrial Revolution on the condition of workers, their subjection to the dictatorship of capitalist entrepreneurs, the dehumanizing division forms of the division of labor, the abject poverty, etc. Messianism, which presents an interruption in the course of history, and utopia, which imagines an alternative to the dominant forms of life, are perhaps not exactly the same theme, but they become associated through their negative relationship to the catastrophic developments of progress itself. This does not liberate the utopian constructions from their close relationship to the representation of history as progress, but it certainly introduces a dramatic modality which is not simply rooted in social critique or moral discontent, but in the feeling of urgency to prevent the doom. Fourier's description of the effects of civilization, what he calls civilization, very negative term in his writings, is a good illustration of this, whereby the element of hope on which somebody like Bloch entirely focuses becomes compounded with an element of anxiety or fragility and risk. All of this perhaps could illustrate the intrinsic orientation of the utopian gesture with the idea of negativity. Utopias do not content themselves with a negative critical attitude of rejection of the existing order of things. They want to concretely, empirically, or experimentally offer alternatives, embark on projects. But utopias, at a closer look, incorporates the negativity into their projects or dreams of another world. They reverse or internally negate the pending catastrophe, or they want to confer a concrete reality to the negation of the negation. Now, it would seem that this is particularly relevant in an age like ours, which is replete with catastrophes on a grand scale, the scale of globalization itself, which would very well correspond to the fact that we observe around us and we feel within ourselves a renewed urgency to invent alternative modes of life, emancipated from the brutality and inhumanity of the dominant neo-capitalist and neo-imperialist institutions. The mutual strengthening of despair and hope, negativity and capacity to create or to invent is more than ever on the order of the day. Bernard said it, and I agree with that. And still, as I suggested, there is an additional twist in the catastrophes of our age, which would seem to block this dialectics and make, in a sense, the hope itself hopeless. No future left, as I said, or a reproductive tendency of the global disorder with a new magnitude in excess to our capacity to exceed the limits of the existing or the arising. Whence this nihilistic appearance of the world that is likely to produce not utopian alternatives, but pulsions of individual and collective destruction. Another degree of nihilism, in fact, something utterly different from the utopian orientation. And perhaps that's the root of some of the dystopias you were alluding to. My answer will be, it comes from the extreme dimensions of the contemporary catastrophes themselves and their completely blocked articulation with the idea of politics or transformation of collective agency. I have three major catastrophes in mind. There is the environmental catastrophe due to global warming, biochemical pollution, and their effects, of course. But it seems to me that its effects on the utopian dimension of politics are best understood if we compare it to others whose historical political magnitude, I would say, is of the same order. Nonetheless, the three are heterogeneous, and I will have to return to the question whether it helps to see them as consequences of the same cause, more precisely capitalism as a mode of production, exploitation, and domination. I call them the nuclear catastrophe, the climatic catastrophe, and the digital catastrophe. Allow me a few words on each. The nuclear catastrophe is the one we had forgotten, that current war in Eastern Europe is bringing back to our attention. Two great thinkers of the past century are especially helpful here. How much time do I still have? Très bien. Hope I'm not bothering you too much. Two great thinkers of the past century are especially helpful here. I mean, Gunther Anders, with his series of writings on the nuclear technopolitics that arose from the discovery, use, and generalization of nuclear weapons after World War II, combined with the developments of civil uses of the nuclear energy. And Edward Palmer Thompson, the great Brit-English historian, with his 1983 essay on exterminism, the last stage of civilization, prompted by the Euro missile crisis, whose analogies and differences with the situation created today by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its Western response are well worth studying. What they have in common, Anders and Thompson, is a double conviction that the mortal dangers involved in the existence of nuclear arsenal in the hands of superpowers and also an increasing number of other states are not essentially deriving from the nature of the political regimes or the moral and intellectual capacities of their leaders, but from the very instability of the equilibrium of terror. And that the whole fabric of society, especially its regime of communications or authority around the potential use of that technological violence, which changes the very concept of war, because by nature it is self-destructive or suicidal. To which we should, of course, add the huge question of how the extremities of warfare in the current world, potential nuclear extermination, and on one end, an actual multiplication of murderous so-called low-intensity conflicts everywhere are linked in a chain. And the equally huge question of how the sovereign disposition of nuclear weapons combines with the counter-insurgency policies aiming at internal enemies, studied in particular by Bernard, in militarizing the society in unprecedented manners. This catastrophe is biopolitical in the sense in which Foucault analyzed the logic of extermination involved in the tradition of sovereign power. I would say that its temporal phenomenology relies on the modality of imminence. The nuclear catastrophe is essentially an imminent catastrophe. On purpose, of course, I resume the famous formula launched by Lenin on the eve of World War I, imminent catastrophe and how to prevent it, sometimes also rendered as the impending catastrophe and how to combat it. Now, the nuclear catastrophe which we are facing today is not imminent in the sense that it will arrive tomorrow unless a political but also utopian counterforce is mobilized. It is imminent in the sense that it can arrive at any moment, but totally unpredictable, or whatever forces are mobilized against it, because there's no way to eliminate the exterminist weapons themselves in a foreseeable future. And the consequences on the regime of utopian alternatives, which I find very disturbing, is not just that the possible alternative seems very unlikely, beyond our reach, but that the existing state of affairs in most part of the world, a regime of unstable peace or pseudo-peace, itself appears as utopia in the ordinary negative sense of the term, a state of affairs that is unrealistic. We live in a utopia and we don't know it, or we are not really aware of it. The climatic catastrophe is the one that, on the contrary, literally obsesses our minds, because year after year, almost day after day, we discover and we experience new dimensions of the destructive effects on the environment, which conditions our lives, our relatively stable coexistence with others, of course, in an extremely unequal and discriminatory manner, socially and racially, but without any possibility for any part of humankind to dissociate themselves, except in some absurd dreams for the rich to emigrate to another planet. Mega fires and mega floods, melting of the polar ice caps and rise of the ocean level, desertification of subequatorial zones, shrinking biodiversity, the sixth mass extinction of species, pollution of air and waters, etc. At the same time, with a mixture of anger, incredulity, and despair, we witness the strategies of denial, delay, and camouflage that make it possible for governments to ignore in practice and draw no consequences from the scientific provisions and recommendations that they have themselves commissioned. And I must add, we observe with equal disarray the incapacity of militant forces around the world to gather momentum and acquire the minimum of internationalist organization that would allow them to make a difference in the political arena. Perhaps the most important in today's world, which does not concern this or that nation, this or that class and race, but the human species as such. I would say that this catastrophe is a cosmological one, in the sense that it affects not our community, the form in which it is organized and governed, but the planetary environment itself, thus making at the same time the human species an efficient agent of destruction and an utterly impotent agent of reparation in the natural world. Its modality is irreversibility. This comes from the fact that the causes of the catastrophe have started to act a long time ago, a time that is not recuperable, and from the fact that the consequences are disproportionate to the causes. For example, in the last 50 years, the Amazonian forest has lost 20% of its size at a rate constantly accelerating. One of the consequences being that the Earth as a whole now emits more carbon than its trees can absorb. One could imagine that a revolution in Brazil and neighboring countries allows it to stop the deforestation. But this will not resurrect the trees, just as the poles and the glaciers will not freeze again. Irreversibility thus means that the catastrophe is behind us as much as it is with us in the present or ahead of us in the future. Utopias are policies with a utopian dimension, especially in the sense that they embody a radical alternative to the current civilization, seem to arrive too late. Or at best, they could have a delaying effect or a mitigating effect on the course of the catastrophe, but they will not install a radically new situation, which is a very disappointing perspective seen in the light of the principle of hope. Unless we try and imagine that the devastated environment with its social component is a miraculous opportunity to invent or perhaps impose a society based on poverty rather than property. Finally, there is a third catastrophe with equally devastating effects on the articulation of utopia, politics, progress, and history. This is perhaps the most ambivalent of all, because it is not univocally perceived as a negative phenomenon, much the contrary. In a sense, and I will return to this, it is rather perceived as a realized utopia itself. But here lies the greatest paradox. Let us call it the digital catastrophe. And I choose this term as an intermediary between the digital revolution, an essentially positive term, which combines the idea of a qualitative leap in the use of computers and internet communications, and the idea that an increasing number of activities, not only productive, but scientific or more generally intellectual, and also relating to the services and the consumptions of everyday life are radically transformed by the use of information technologies, relying on digital encoding and treatment, to culminate in the expansion of artificial intelligence. And the other idea, which is digital disaster. You find this easily on Wikipedia. An idea that can be applied either locally and partially, for instance, to designate the effects of a crash, a cyber attack, or mass hacking on some vital activities such as electricity supply, or classified intelligence, or health protection, or globally. For instance, if you submit that the exponential development of calculation capacities will require gigantic consumptions of energy and raw materials, such as rare metals, thus multiplying the ecological devastation due to extractive industry. I made this choice because I was above all interested here in the anthropological dimension of this catastrophe, which is really creating new humans or a new human condition as a consequence of the penetration of procedures and instruments of artificial communication and the automatic governance of conduct into every moment of our intersubjective relations, which themselves shape or construct our personal identities and individual lives or trajectories. Work, research, education, sexual encounters, artistic life, and leisure, security, there will be, and in fact, there already is no exception to this total subsumption, to borrow a Marxian category. At least, again, excuse me. I have no doubt that this catastrophe has intimate links with a new capitalist age, which is not only based on the technological revolution, but also on the realization of a new great transformation, in Polanyi's words, a new level of commodification of our lives, where not only means of production and objects of consumption are produced as commodities, but services and above all moments of our physical and mental care of ourselves, to put it in Foucauldian terms, are commodified and incorporated in financial circuits such as Google or Facebook, etc. And I also agree that this is connected to a new civilization of surveillance engineered by the big state machines administering this contemporary capitalism, as explained by Shoshana Zuboff and others. But my main point concerns the anthropological dimension itself as a chain of consequences which are again not commensurable with the cause. The production of a new world in which new humans live. This is now sometimes called the metaverse, or also, I find this even more revealing, the augmented reality, which is not so much characterized by the emergence of another virtual world than by the increasing presence and active participation in our world of the representatives of the virtual world, be they robots or simply images or messages automatically generated. Here, the alteration of the perception of history and historical temporality works in the opposite direction, neither imminent nor irreversible. We could say that this catastrophe is permanently anticipating its own development, or it is essentially planned. In French, I would say programmé, to unfold beyond any quantitative or qualitative limit. And the consequences on the status of utopias and utopian thinking is just the opposite of what I suggested to observe in the case of the other catastrophes. Not a neutralization or reduction to impotency, but a kind of maximization of the utopian desire, which is also its appropriation by the anonymous powers of the system. But of course, these anonymous powers incarnate themselves in the discourses and entrepreneurial activities of managers and financial magnates, the Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks. And above all, they can be enthusiastically accepted and interiorized by their own targets, that is, all of us, actual or potential digitalized subjects. This generates a form of mass material voluntary servitude, not based on religion or ideologies, but on the very use of our digital instruments. And it dovetails with a special kind of utopian thinking, which has always existed, but acquires a much greater attractivity that we can call accelerationism in general, for which interesting manifestos have been produced in the recent period, and I'm not intending to minimize their degree of inventiveness and intelligence. In a sense, it confronts social and political utopias with the paradox that they are not perceived, no longer perceived as ahead of their time, but rather continuously lacking behind its own acceleration. This was perhaps a bit too long on the negative side, but I thought it was indispensable not only to prompt a discussion on the mutations of the age-old articulation of utopia with progress and catastrophes, but to suggest a positive line of reflection. It is prompted, in fact, by the contrast that we can identify between the global character of the catastrophes, which seem to either cancel the utopian capacity or expropriate it in the service of a more absolute system of domination, and the partial character of the concrete utopias that Bernard Harcourt has asked us to put at the center of our attention in this seminar throughout the year. I would gladly resume the neologism that my late friend Immanuel Wallerstein had used as title of one of his books published in 1998, Utopistics or Historical Choices of the 21st Century. Let's try and conclude by practicing some utopistic methodological reflections, or simply list the questions that need to be addressed to overcome at least some of the paradoxes involved in the previous descriptions. The first proposition that I would defend is the following. Our starting point, and I merely repeat what has just been said, must be the fact that while on the side of its most abstract presuppositions, the category utopia appears increasingly fragile or destabilized, on the other side, there should be no doubt that utopias exist more than ever in a practical form, or they are implemented in the field in many different forms, with greater or smaller success, greater or lesser capacity to gain support from their outside, which is also a condition, of course, for their capacity to last or to survive. An important question particularly emphasized in the work of Erik Olin Wright, already quoted, who speaks of viability, but not the same question as possibility or impossibility in my mind. To exist is to emerge in the real and to struggle for survival, not to exist forever. All the more because a utopia that has lived for some time in determinate conditions never disappears without leaving traces, some trace. So, At some point, we must operate the conversion that the theorist Miguel Abensour was asking us to perform, but not a conversion from the satisfactions or dissatisfactions of the existing world towards the hopes and endeavors of the ideal world, but from the global negativity of the catastrophes to the partial, therefore concrete positivity of the real or concrete utopias which are already part of our world. Second, I would put this idea in relation with the fact that for sure, real and concrete utopias are anti-capitalist. That is, they think or dream of themselves in terms of an opposition to the basic structures of the capitalist society, the commodification of vital goods, needs, and services, the continuous extension of inequalities, the recuperation of all the ancient forms of domination based on anthropological differences such as race, age, or gender in the service of the modern individualism, etc. But they have a tendency, which I find very interesting, to address the structures of exploitation and domination, not from the point of view of the causes, of the ultimate cause, what my master used to call the determination in the last instance, but from the point of view of the consequences, the effects with their own logic and specificities. In other terms, the questions that they try to resolve are not transhistorical questions of the evolution of mankind that in a famous passage of his 1859 preface to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx had called very imprudently the problems of mankind, that mankind is always able to resolve because history has already prepared solutions. Rather, they are questions that are immediately accessible. I wanted to say visible in the framework of everyday life, even if, of course, they have ramifications that can be traced to the global conditions themselves. Questions of power relations, of social roles and functions, of modes of consumption, of distribution and distributive justice, of attitudes towards and within labor. This installs apparently a gap between the idea of concrete utopia and the idea of revolution. They both try and turn the world upside down, although not at the same level or scale. Another consideration that we can attach to this difference is the fact that concrete utopias orient themselves in a direction almost antithetic to the method followed by the inventor of the name Thomas More in his Utopia, a theory, his theory, which is completely based on the, if you read the text, it's amazing, a progressive reduction of all the evils of society to a single fundamental cause, namely the institution of private property. And in a sense, Marx himself and the modern socialists with him never really moved away from this inspiration, except that for them, of course, property had become a much more complex structure inscribed in relations of production and not just legal forms. And finally, this would explain why in my previous presentation of the great catastrophes that we are facing today, I was not so keen on reducing their logic to the single notion of capitalism or the domination of capital. Not because I would deny that exterminism, global warming, or digital total subsumption are connected to capitalism, or that we may not hope to confront them efficiently without indicting capitalism, but because I believe that the chances to create alternatives do not reside at the abstract level of putting an end to the capitalist mode of production. They reside in the capacity to address the questions of war and peace, aggressivity and armaments, ways of life and distribution of resources, modes of interaction with the digital equipment, and so on. Third, I'm done. I will submit that concrete utopias ought to be considered as heterotopias. Again, I repeat you, in a sense derived from Foucault's analysis in the now celebrated essay Of Other Spaces that he had presented to an audience of progressive architects early in his career, 1966, amazing year in Foucault's career, The Order of Things, and so on. Then left aside, and finally resurrected in his very last month. This translation into a different language, however, calls for several methodological precautions. One of them has to do with the complex question of shifting from a temporal perspective to a spatial perspective, which is Foucault's rationale for dropping the name Utopia and propose the name Heterotopia. But in fact, the association of the idea of utopia with an imagination and a preparation for the future, an anticipation of the times to come, is not the originary meaning of the idea. It is rather a secondary interpretation, which, as I tried to recall, has a direct relationship to the dominance of a certain modern and Western concept of history as progress. The more intrinsic idea to which Foucault precisely returns is linked to alterity, alteration, and alternative, a life governed by other norms than the dominant norms. And Foucault's idea is that otherness, even radical otherness, the deviation from the dominant norms, is not so much to be found hypothetically in the future, a possible world to come, but rather in this world, inasmuch as it is essentially heterogeneous, making room for otherness or deviancy within its own spaces, not without conflict, of course. Now, this leads to a second critical remark. Foucault uses, and you said it, Foucault uses the category space in a broad metaphoric sense, which oscillates between structure or institution and the description of environments, territories, places, and regions. The heterotopias that he mainly proposes us are not, in fact, the result of choices, experiments in a life liberated from certain social norms and dominant relations of power. At least, this is not how he introduces the category in the beginning. They are rather places where the dominant norms isolate and control their own deviancy, like prison houses and lunatic hospitals or brothels, or produce the appearance of absolute freedom, like, very interestingly, theaters. We may, of course, move to another more extensive use of the category heterotopia to denote the actuality of concrete utopias which are born somewhere around us and call us to join them. This will mean that we exchange the phenomenology of internal exclusion, which dominates much of Foucault's description, for the phenomenology of secession, or as Michael Hart and Tony Negri proposed to call it exodus, bringing back a religious and, in fact, messianic language. It will not cancel the element of ambivalence that inhabits every reflection on the articulation of autonomy and separation or enclosure. It is probably a basic materialistic axiom that the more isolated a community or a practice or an experience tends to be, the more dependent its proclaimed autonomy can become with respect to external conditions that are not its own choice. This is very clearly illustrated by the history of such utopias heterotopias, as for instance, the communist experiment of Chiapas, based on the alliance of a movement of Mexican so-called indigenos with a group of former Marxist intellectuals and activists, which has now succeeded to resist the assault of the Mexican state for 30 years. Or perhaps even better, by the example of autochthonous peoples in the Amazons, who, with enormous difficulties, it must be said, resist the deforestation and the expropriation of their native territories because they are not only inventing a form of politics rooted in other representations of the relation between man and nature than the one imposed by the colonial and capitalist world. They are also very consciously proposing a cosmopolitanism based on the mutual recognition and convergence of interests of the autochthonous communities locally and the global resistance against the environmental catastrophe. The results are uncertain, but the method based on the unity of opposites, of the opening of the heterotopia towards its own other or exterior is very clear, at least it seems to me. And finally, I would like to bring in the idea that the understanding of the notion of community or solidarity is the key to the interpretation of the properly political character of concrete utopias, which develop in the institutional spatial horizon of this world, rather than in the hypothetic temporal horizon of the future. The category of the community is antinomic par excellence. So it should be no surprise that the construction of utopias in the form of autonomous communities concentrates what Fredric Jameson rightly describes as the intrinsic antinomies of utopian imagination and practice. This is not only a question of an ideological conflict between the solidarities, the local and partial solidarities, the self-reliance of the utopian communities based on rules that they establish for themselves, and excuse me, I'm lost my eyes, and the universalism of the human values that they promote ideologically, a conflict that the Saint-Simonians tried to resolve by instituting a religion of humanity as ideological cement of their communities of brothers and sisters, and Marx, in a more secular manner, apparently at least, in describing the proletariat as a universal class whose very alienation, because it was radical, would exclude a particularistic interest. It is rather, I believe, a question of, again, the ambivalent articulation of autonomy and closure or enclosure. I would put it brutally in the form, is there ever a guarantee that a secession from the dominant norms or the dominant order will not create a prison for its own members, or some of them? For instance, the next generation, the children of those who invented the utopian community and for whom it is not a choice, but a heritage. And my tentative answer would be no, there is no guarantee. For this reason, a concrete utopia struggles against itself as much as it struggles against the enemy or the dominant order. For this question, we might also want to turn towards other crucial, concrete utopias of our time, from which we all draw inspiration. For instance, the Black Lives Matter movement and its resurrection in different conditions of the Black Power movement of 2 generations ago, which also leads me to introducing a formula frequently used by my colleague and friend Jacques Rancière in his discussions of communism, inspired by a combined reading of Marx's early works and the contemporary utopias of the French proletariat that he brings together as much as possible instead of opposing them. But also more indirectly, I believe a reactivation of the Surrealists' alliance of the Marxian motto, transformer le monde, to change the world, with the poet Arthur Rimbaud's exclamation, change la vie, let life change, be other. Rancière's formula, which I find very adequate to our critical and foundational reflection on concrete utopias, is, I quote of memory, communist or utopian communities are communautés de lutte et communautés de vie. Communities where struggling and living are not separated. The struggle inspired a different life, and the invention of a new way of life gives the struggle its strength and methods. That doesn't prevent community or solidarity from being problematic, but it indicates in which sense the problems are addressed, what kind of other politics is applied to their resolution. Thank you so much, and I apologize for it.
Merci. Merci, Étienne. Is this on? Yes. Okay. So that was marvelous and the perfect way to begin our discussion. Now, we're operating in real time right now, in the sense that, unfortunately, no one had the opportunity yet to read the paper, which will be up tomorrow. So you'll be able to go back over it and reread it. So what I thought I would do is try as best as I can right now to quickly summarize or repeat or kind of like give the outline of the paper in a way so that everyone can be on the same page, if that would be helpful. And then pose a few questions, open it up, have a conversation. But I thought I would try. So Étienne, tell me if I misunderstood you, but I think it would be helpful just to kind of synthesize your extraordinary presentation for a moment. So basically, the point of departure, as I understand this paper, is a paradox. And it's the paradox that on the one hand, utopia is so compelling today because progress bleeds into catastrophe. And so you spoke of three spaces of progress bleeding into catastrophe, which were the climate, the nuclear, and the digital, places where hopes for change, including, for instance, digital technologies, et cetera, result in forms of catastrophe that are what, in a way, make utopia so compelling, right? But, and this is the paradox, if I understood correctly, the catastrophes also seem to make utopian projects impossible at the same time. So they're both what stimulate the urge, the intention to utopia, and also what makes it impossible. And you had this brilliant formulation of the conditions of impossibility, right? Which I particularly appreciated there.
Derrida.
Yes. So that is the paradox, is an embarrassment. It's a circle that we're caught in a way, in which these forms of catastrophe that are linked to progress themselves undermine at the same time and nourish the urge for utopia and utopian thinking. And that was, in a way, the negative part of the paper, or the description that is, in some sense, harrowing and difficult, which then led you to propose, I would say, three ways forward, perhaps. The first was this idea that although utopias, and concrete utopias in particular, are very fragile, you suggest they exist more than ever as practical utopias. So this is the idea of as partial utopias, actually, which is the important point. It's that the utopias, in a sense, have become more partial, less systematic, less kind of coherent. And it's in their partiality that there is this element of concreteness and that they exist more than ever. Second, that we've shifted from trying to understand deep causality, systematicity, the kinds of systematicity that we often associate with 19th century idealism and then Marxism, right? And that rather, I mean, and I sense that in a way there's a shift to a kind of a more Foucauldian emphasis on relations of power that allow us then to see more visible targets for our utopian interventions, and that those targets are precisely what you refer to as the need to target war and peace, armaments, ways of life, use of resources, modes of interaction with digital equipment. Distribution of resources was something you added, actually, as you were speaking. So this idea that kind of we shift away from some kind of deeper systematicity to get at, well, you referred to consequences, but the ways in which kind of resources are distributed. And then the third point, as I heard you, was to shift or to understand these concrete utopias through the lens of heterotopias. And by that, I take it, although I'll come back to this in a question, by that I take it to the heterogeneity of these interventions, right? Focusing on the fact that they can be multiple different utopian projects that we might be engaged in. Now, so those were the three ways forward that I heard you mention. And of course, you conclude then with this final brilliant point, which I embrace. First, that community and solidarity need to be key parts of concrete utopias, but that in a way, concrete utopias not only fight against dystopias in the world, but also fight against themselves. A concrete utopia struggles against itself, you suggested, which is something about the temporality, I think, of concrete utopias and the way in which a utopia inevitably, in a way, becomes an illusion, maybe. This is really a radical theory of illusions, I think, but that the next generation will see our utopias and think of them as constraints, maybe. But that in a way, we have no alternative but to live with that is inevitable. And so utopian action becomes a way of life that is going to be transformed over time, rejected, changed, and taken up again by later generations, hopefully. So I wanted to kind of present that as maybe a synthesis of the paper, so that everyone is on the same page, or at least we can all, or you can all fight against that interpretation. Okay. So thank you, Étienne. And again, the full paper will be online shortly. So we'll all have the opportunity to contest that reading.
I need to enter these written corrections that I did this afternoon.
Okay.
And that you signaled. This
So
will be done, I hope,
yeah,
by tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll get it done. Now, so that raises then, at least for me, quickly, just a few questions, and then I want to just give you an opportunity to tell us whether that was a misreading or not, but then also open it up for our conversation as best possible. Now, the first thought is something about the paradox of the theoretical lightening that's going on right now with the concept of utopia, and at least the way you were presenting it. And I think that's right. I mean, I think that is, I think I too sense that, and I too, in part, this 1313 is an outgrowth of possibly a theoretical lightening, just moving away from kind of the systematicity. And I'm wondering if that's right, what is attributable for that need now? Could it be the exigencies of the time? Could it be the fact of being at the precipice, or the notion that there is no future, right? Or that there is no distant future, that there is no time left, as I opened the seminar? Could it be that we need to we can no longer wait for agreement? We can no longer wait for agreement of a systematic nature, and that we need, in a way, to act, and therefore we pay more attention to the consequences, the visible, right? What is it that is bringing about that, what I identify, maybe wrongly, tell me though, as a theoretical lightening that shifts the focus? And the second question, or the second issue, is whether it has something to do with the problems of collective action and the need for our own action in the present, in the immediate, right? Because is it possible that with this theoretical lightening, it might be possible to engage in utopian exercise, reality, concrete utopian forms on you and me, right? In a small collectivity that doesn't require maybe a revolution, but could be satisfied with our working together, just us, right? Is that what might be behind some of this theoretical lightening? And then the third point was about heterotopias, because I mean, it's a puzzling piece, because heterotopias include clearly identified dystopias, as you mentioned, the prison, the asylum, the boarding school. These are forms. I mean, he does away in that essay very quickly with the notion of utopia as a non-space. It's just a simple paragraph, and that's it. Utopia is thrown away and replaced by this other spatiality outside of society that would be the heterotopias. I find that there's somehow a danger then to embracing the term, and so I'm trying to see whether there might not be another term instead, Uterotopias, or something that has the notion of what's the word? Heterogeneity, whatever, right? But that isn't the category that includes the prison. All right, so those are three quick thoughts. Maybe you can tell us at least whether I was on target or not, and then we can open it up. We're going to have a mic. We've also got Zoom. I've forgotten how to do all of this, but I know Fonda is somewhere and is going to help me figure this all out. But let me turn it first back to you, Étienne, for just a few comments as to whether that was helpful.
I've spoken a lot. I cannot ignore your questions, but I will certainly not give full answers. Let me take them in reverse order, maybe. First, heterotopia is indeed a fascinating notion and also a problematic one. We agree on that. It's a notion that, interestingly, more or less escapes. I mean, Foucault's essay of other spaces is, as always or almost always, a model of precision, pointedness, I would say, and authority. It derives from a series of talks that Foucault gave at the French for the French radio, which you can find, called Utopia and Heterotopia, or you in the plural or singular. I'm not completely sure. So where the confrontation is developed. This is the young Foucault. I remember his voice. You tremble. You have the feeling that if you just diverge a little bit, you'll be cut into pieces. Anyway, so the date, I believe, I mean, the return, the reasons why Foucault retrieved that text written in 1966, totally forgotten, totally ignored, and published it a few months before his death. I don't entirely know, you, or certainly the editors know, he must have been asked to do it. But also we may imagine that suddenly what had been explained in the text was again speaking to him very strongly. Now the context of the first publication, I believe is important, and I'm not going to teach a class, but I said amazing year. This if you look at what he publishes in this year, it's completely unbelievable. But the context, it seems to me, remains to some extent, I would say, the battalion context around the idea of transgression. So that's the reason why a classification of, say, spaces of transgression into a dual, bipolar, so to speak, a dichotomy of dystopias and utopias is not satisfying, is not relevant. The attraction, the passion for evil is there in the text. So of course, prisons, hospitals, etc., are places of how do you say malheur in English? Of misery.
Yes, misery. Yeah.
Of misery. There are also places where you can find the guys who perhaps as a terrible fate find themselves in opposition with the existing moral and social norms. But then, of course, there's the idea that that Foucault renounced later, I believe, that you can play with that you can use these translations as these transgressions as models for another, a radically other form of subjectivity or subjectivation. So to conclude, I'm too long. I'm sorry. The question of the spaces is very important in the institutional sense. The important fact is that the places are closed. That is precisely what makes it possible for the society as a whole to, I believe I see John Reichman, who knows much more than me about all that, make it possible for the society to control, in fact, this deviancy. And that's where I take a kind of inspiration for the question, not the idea, but for the question of the kind of enclosure that always more or less inevitably goes along with transgression or the quest for otherness. Okay, that's too long. As for, so I will not give you ideally, I was already very long, but I thought that that I needed them to, of course, return to the question of the articulation of the idea of politics or the concept of politics with the representation of time. But there was no question of doing that. I'm not even sure I could do it. I will keep thinking. My idea is neither that you face a choice between real politics and utopian politics, if you like, or utopian or your utopian gesture and activity, nor that in the end, as you seem to suggest at some point, for despair of succeeding at the global level, we ought now to reduce our political actions and initiatives to the partial and local level. My idea, right or wrong, that's why I also thank you for quoting the final essay of the volume Histoire interminable, and I'm still working on that. Every occasion is good. Is the idea that politics is heterogeneous itself. So I tried to use three categories. Perhaps the combination of the three recreates something like a meaningful equivalent for the present of the idea of revolution, which I find too indiscriminate or totalizing. So I said regulations, for example, regulations of armaments, regulations of the use of certain forms of energy, etc. Insurrections and utopias or utopian experiments. So my tentative idea is that politics always was, and more than ever today, is multi-dimensional in that sense. But it is not the case that you will have some people working on regulations, others preparing insurrections, and still others experimenting utopias. These determinations penetrate each other. And this is also why I find it particularly interesting that, in fact, none of the I hope we talk about that in the next sessions. None of the concrete utopias that you discuss, each is well defined with a place of origin, a category of people involved, forms of solidarity that they invent, objectives that they assign themselves, etc. But none is in fact becoming precisely a hospital or a prison house, etc. If only because they meet counterattacks and objections and obstacles, and therefore need to establish communications with completely other people. And I leave aside the lightning for, but the linearity of time is not, of course, the only representation of time that we may associate, I believe, with an idea of what you call the lightning, and its articulation with catastrophes. The problem with Bloch and some others is that what they oppose to the linear time of the historicist representation of modernity is the creativity of time. And if you take Benjamin, of course, it's not the creativity, it's the interruption which makes it possible for repressed insurrections to return into the present. So it's radical discontinuity. The spectrum of I'd say phenomenologies of historical time is open.
All right, good. So let's do this. Let me get a mic, and what we'll take is 3. Maybe we can start with 3. Why don't you introduce yourself? And then we'll take 3.
Forgive me, I'm a little very eager to hear you. I speak badly because I'm tired.
Speak loud and clear.
Speak loud and give a name or a nickname or something.
I try my best. Thank you, Etienne,
You
for
are?
My name is Dominic. I'm from Frankfurt, doing my PhD there. Yeah, thank you for your third marvelous talk within 10 days. I want to take up Bernard's question number 3 about the connection of you and me, because Foucault is talking about the body when he speaks about heterotopia. He writes, le corps il est le point zéro du monde. And my question is whether, when we combine that with you, what you have said about leaving traces, I'm just interested in how you would say that my agency or powerlessness is still something that lies in our bodies as a history of common affection that we have to conquer somehow. And thinking about Castoriadis and his version of imagination, and what you have to think about this connection, because you haven't talked about the body and about the last part of Foucault. I know it was already quite dense, but maybe you can just give some insights of that these traces are already there, and that might be the utopian moment, that we never know what's in us and what's the relation to the other one, and we will never know because we are always out of ourselves and connected to others, but in all despair nobody can take that away. So that might be some version of hope.
Great, thanks. We've got one question here, and then we'll take Shela Benhabib, who's on Zoom.
This is Yahya Madra.
Je les suis, oui, je les note, oui.
This is Yahya Madra from the journal Rethinking Marxism. The comment and question I have is the shift between the two sections of the paper. From the first part, which was about the catastrophe and progress, and a certain antinomy is articulated there, a set of antinomies.
I don't hear you well.
Oh.
Okay, keep on going.
So exactly, and but the concrete utopias part and the catastrophe, let's say, and it seems to me that the first part is more in the Kantian dynamic antinomy, and the second part is in the Kantian mathematical antinomy. Also Lacan's sexuation formulas, the logic of non-all. So what I'm trying to say is not just a philosophical question, but a practical question, that we need to shift our way of understanding the antinomy to be able to see concrete utopias and theorize them, that we need a different conceptual framework, a different, there's a difference embedded in the paper, it sounded to me.
Great, and then let's go to Sheila Ben Habib. Is this going to work? Yes.
Where are you, Sheila?
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes. No, we can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Your
thank
camera
you
is
very
turned
much.
off. If you want to turn your camera on, you could.
Okay. I'll be happy to turn my camera on, but it doesn't seem to go. The host has stopped it. Anyway, somebody has to turn it on. This was an amazing lecture. Etienne, thank you so much. I really learned a great deal and was thinking with you. And Bernard was very kind to start with my first book that is 35 years old. One feels very aged counting these things, but I do want to say a couple of things in defense of, maybe not in defense, but in the elucidation of that concept of utopia, and then come to your lecture with a question. My purpose in that book was to try to suggest against what I called a kind of Whig reading of Habermas as a very unidirectional defense of liberal democracy in place of Marxism. Right? This was a discussion within the second, third generation of Frankfurt School theorists, what was happening to critical theory. And I wanted to insist on the dimension of utopia that one could still see in paradigms like discourse ethics, and not just simply reduce something like discourse ethics to a kind of banal universalizability, although universalizability is never banal. Now, there were two dimensions of the concept of utopia in the Frankfurt School that came into this. One is, of course, the principle that it is possible to imagine an alternative to earthly misery, right? This is Horkheimer's version, that it's possible to imagine another state of the world besides earthly misery. And already at the end of the dialectic of enlightenment, this is there. And the second is the messianic notion that comes from Walter Benjamin, which is a critique of the concept of progress. And Benjamin says, at every moment, the Messiah can enter. And that is, utopia does not presuppose progress, but every moment is the moment in which something can erupt. For me, these two ideals Of course, they are historically, the moment of the book is historical, etc. But there is something about these ideals, the radical imagination and the idea that time can be interrupted. And I find this, for example, I believe in the sentence of Martin Luther King when he says to forge a stone of hope out of a mountain of despair, right? Make a stone of hope out of a mountain of despair. It is maybe theological. There is a theological aspect to it, but it's also about motivational. What makes people act in the midst of the catastrophes that you so brilliantly pointed to? And this is my last remark. This is an age of nihilism, despair, escapism, end of times. And it seems to me as if one undeniable meaning of utopia is the hope to act, the ethical impulse. It is an ethical, maybe theological impulse that somehow tomorrow can be different than today. Not necessarily better, not paradise, but that you can do something about tomorrow. So I just want to say how much I learned from the lecture, but I want to insist on that one particular dimension of utopia.
Thank you, Shayla. Étienne, do you want to try and address those questions, and then we'll do another round?
Yes, I can. You are all opening and revealing all the hidden or not so hidden aporias and weaknesses of my argument. This is very clear to me. So you asked a question about why I neglected an important part of Foucault's argument, which comes essentially at the end. I haven't reread it very recently, but I believe to remember at the end of his essay that concerns the importance of bodies. So of course I could limit myself to a kind of general, I would say, standard recapitulation or repetition of what at some point Foucault presented almost as his ontology, you know, for which he looked for references in the Stoic philosophy and so on, where essentially there are only bodies. So if there are only bodies, their actions, their capacities to speak, I'm almost tempted to say the noise that they make and that they produce, by definition, the analysis of heterotopias will rely on the phenomenology of bodily actions and transformations. But that's probably not very interesting. What is more interesting, I believe, is the idea that normality and abnormality, which really is the fundamental anthropological question, but also political question that permeates Foucault's writings at that time, and perhaps throughout his life, is concentrated in the ways disciplinary and seats of power, I would say, in which bodies are shaped, educated, and related to one another. So which implicitly I believe, and I said that there is a series of talks on Utopia and Heterotopia, but I haven't listened to that again for a very, very long time now, even if I try and give you an idea of the kind of impression that Foucault's voice would make on us all. So perhaps this is said somewhere, but I submit that the shift, Foucault always loved he loved the dichotomies. He changed dichotomies all the time, but the presentations of issues in the form of choices. Either you go this way or you go that way, but don't believe that you can have it both ways. So when he summarizes the history of French philosophy, you go in the direction of consciousness, subjectivity, etc., or you go in the direction of concepts, structures, etc. But and here it's more or less the same. I mean, utopia or heterotopia, time or space, and probably spirit, something like that, or bodily practices. So it is your body that is subjected, and it's with your body that you resist or you transgress. So I'll have to and I'm not against that. I mean, I don't know if the choice is often accused of being an extremely eclectic kind of philosopher who always wants to keep all the orientations at the same time, be at the same time a reformist and a revolutionary, an idealist and a materialist, and all that. So I would not say that ideas, or perhaps even better, myths or images are not fundamental. But I would certainly agree that concrete utopias, in the sense that we're trying to discuss here, let, I would say, their originality and power emerge and become visible in the manner in which they activate the capacities of bodies. So a fascinating question. The next question, but leave it now, would be to see if I can articulate what I tried to say at the end about communities with what the question you asked about bodies. I'm not aware that Foucault has spoken very much about. He certainly speaks about the transference from one body to another of influences, forms of power, action upon an action, and so on. But the construction of so to speak, collective bodies, or unless perhaps in Discipline and Punish. I mean, through. Okay, very, very. Yahya, am I on the side of Kant with the catastrophes, or on the side of Lacan with the concrete utopias that are not all? That are not all. Let's reconcile them for once. Let's reconcile them through, I would say, introduction of the tragic dimension of all that. So the Kant's certainly my attempt at enumerating the absolute catastrophes for which we have no solution and will have no global solution in the form. That's why I quoted Thomas More's reasoning. The heart of Thomas More's reasoning in Utopia, which is absolutely beautiful, and that is completely inherited by the Marxist and the socialist tradition in general, is the scholastic formula, the formula tollata causa tollitur effectus. Take away the cause and you'll get rid of the effects. And the Marxian, I said, my master, you recognize the Althusser, etc. And the Marxists, with their last instance, were still in there. They are still in there. So change, transform the last instance, substitute a socialist or communist interesting hesitation mode of production to the capitalist mode of production, and you'll eliminate all the catastrophic consequences. So of course, I may have given the impression that I completely give up on the hope of addressing and controlling these catastrophes. Although I have to admit that I find it very difficult to imagine. But the core of my idea or inspiration, if you like, if we must abandon the causal scheme, which is mechanical, in fact. And as a consequence, that's of course the case in Kant, inevitably the reverse, the reverse side, which is the teleology of the intention, the final, the Endzweck, the final goal. And therefore, of course, we'll have to remain in the horizon of tragedy. That is alternatives for which there is no solution that can be, so to speak, exhibited. And that's not incompatible with Lacan. And finally, Sheila, I mean, thank you. I don't know if she's still here.
Yes, she's still here.
Are you still here, Sheila?
Yes.
I mean, it's such an honor, Sheila, and such a pleasure. I hope we
I'm here.
find an opportunity to be in the same room in person someday if I'm still there. But what you bring is not only a theoretical clarification, but it's also a direct echo, I would say, of this Frankfurt critical tradition in its most demanding, I would say, or radical form. So of course Habermas is not the villain. He's not the bad guy who abandoned the exigencies and the radical alternatives of his masters to rally a reformist, liberal kind of acceptable discourse. This is not what you say, and this is not what Habermas is. And I'm especially, I find it especially important to say that because many of his recent interventions on several subjects, Europe's refugees, the war in this moment, demonstrate that the sense of tragedy is very alive in Habermas himself. This being said, the two principles that you mentioned, on one side, to imagine the possibility of another world or another way of life, perhaps as important as world, because it's more intensive and less perhaps spatial precisely. And on the other side, the messianic idea of the interruption, it seems to me that I was trying to go also in that direction in my first discussion of the articulation of classical utopias with catastrophic circumstances. So of course, Bernard said that in the continuation, I seemed to perceive only the negative side and the impossibility, the conditions of impossibility rather than the conditions of possibility. But I hope this doesn't sound as a pure joke or play on words. And that's why I said, but this comes from Derrida, because Derrida's idea, and he has had a conversation or with the Frankfurt School, in fact, on that, is that you can never separate conditions of possibility from conditions of impossibility. So impossibility is not just a dead end. It's not just the wall. Here you stop. It's impossible. That's the banal traditional representation of the opposition between realism and utopia. So in your first presentation, and I think this dovetails with Sheila's remarks, you said the current interest on concrete utopia displaces and in a sense refutes this mechanical alternative. And I would be tempted to say what you do with the impossible or the conditions of impossibility is not you say, okay, I give up, I resign myself. It's rather, of course, how do I handle the impossible?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go. We have one more round. I've got Dorothea and Stoller, and then I've got somebody on Zoom. So let me pass you this. Sorry. And then what I propose is I see a lot of other hands. I'm gonna open up the blog to like continuing conversations. So anyone who wants to ask, who make a comment instead of asking a question or whatever, I mean, just turn it into your comment, and then we'll post all of these as resources as part of this conversation.
And if I can, I will react. Okay. Yes, please. Your
Hi,
name?
I'm Dorothea.
Dorothea.
Okay. Let me just start by saying that it's such an honor to be speaking with you today. Your work, the philosophy of Marx, really shapes, I guess, I would say, like, awakened me from my dogmatic slumber. But in any case, I guess I have sort of a question about your discussions about the importance of, I guess, insulation or closing off in your concept of utopia, that it seems necessary in order to sustain transgression in the present state of things, that it's somehow closed off. I guess I wonder. I wonder to what extent that really is necessary, and here I'm going back to.
You wonder in which sense what is necessary?
Sorry, the closing off, the
Closing off, okay.
insulation, yes,
Okay, the
to
insulation. Yes, yes,
sustaining
Yes, I understand.
transgression.
I understand.
Here, I think I would like to go back to Marx, to his chapter on the working day and capital, where he talks about how the dispute over the length of the working day leads to a kind of antinomy between of right against right. It seems to me that perhaps this sort of separation between transgression and the rest of society might not be so necessary.
Very good point.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Stoller.
Yes.
Dear Étienne, ordinarily I wouldn't take up the time because I get to write with you and talk with you in all kinds of ways. And we all know that you offer us more to think with, how to ask better questions, not answers. But I have something that concerns me, and it's, you will either go, or say, well, maybe. There's an undercurrent, an undertow even, in all of the thinking that goes into what is utopia. I have trouble somewhat with it as a noun, rather than finding the verbal forms in which we want to engage it. That's number one. I'm really surprised when we're trying to reinvent so much that we would leave it in a noun form. That's one
what?
thing. A noun, a noun,
A noun.
A noun rather than a verb.
A noun.
a noun,
Yes.
rather than a verb.
Yes.
Okay. But what strikes me is that in everything we've been talking about, from Sheila's to yours to Bernard, we're talking about a set of affects, sentiments. We're talking about despair. We're talking, some people would consider one sentiment hope. I'm not sure I would. We're talking about ressentiment. We're talking about resentment. We're talking about envy of the rich. We're talking about jealousy. We're talking about such an enormous set of sentiments that go into a new possible thinking about affective regimes. What I don't understand is why there's never an explicit discussion. There's never an explicit discussion of how much utopia entails and demands a reconfiguration, a transformation of the affective regimes in which we live. It's not only the affective regime, it's the actual meaning of how a particular sentiment operates. So if we're looking at Audre Lorde, anger for Nietzsche, it was one bad thing, but anger in a new world is actually what we need. Indignation, resentment being not only a moral virtue, but a political virtue. What I'm thinking of is why that remains so submerged, what actually it takes, if we're talking about the concrete, to me, the affect is the concrete. We're talking about and I'll stop right here, that a word we both love that you introduced me to, but you never write about, politicality. Politicality.
Politicality?
Yes. Don't you remember? See, you only wrote about it once. I write about it all the
That's
time.
ugly.
That is the potential.
It's an ugly word.
It's a beautiful word. The potential that resides in something which has the possibility of becoming political.
Yeah.
That affect is actually that grammar of affect is that domain. So I'm just wondering why it always recedes and always it never gets to be part of the kind of brilliant theorization you do.
Did you want to jump on that, Kendall?
I just want to jump very quickly on this noun verb question, because I think it relates to the comment that was made earlier about bringing the body into the conversation. And specifically, I'm wondering about the limits of the conceptualization of utopia in terms of space or place, right? What if we were to think about utopia as a verb, or in an alternative formulation, as a bodily practice, as an embodied practice, right? So I'm thinking about the transgender movement, which Paisley Curra many years ago brilliantly described as a movement that seeks the dissolution of the very category around which it organized. Because I'm trying to figure out whether there's some way in thinking about this question of the utopia of one generation becoming the prison of the next, right? Whether an attitude toward utopia that sees utopia as praxis rather than as place, that actually leans into the etymology of no place, right? If it's no place, then maybe it's just a practice that is mindful, sort of like of its own, mindful of its concretion in the following sense, right? Like a geode, right? That has this stuff inside it, which recognizes that this stuff that is inside it is extinguishing it, right? Dissolving it in the practice, right? So I don't know.
Or a potential for new political.
Or potential, exactly. So I'm just wondering if you will think for a few minutes about what it would mean to shift from an understanding of utopia, not as a place, but as an embodied practice. And since we're talking about bodies, we're talking about entities that will themselves dissolve. So this dissolving body whose practice of utopia is organized, at least in part, around the dissolution of the utopia that it is practicing now for the sake of future utopias, of a future politics, right?
Great, thank you, Kendall. And Kendall, Jewel, I'd like this as an essay.
Tag team you
I want
here.
it. I'd like it as an essay for the website. Okay, for this. All right.
Sure.
So you talk about that between you two.
Yeah.
We're gonna have one more intervention on Zoom. Eva Correder. Eva, can you hear us?
Is that Eva Corredor?
Yes.
Oh, Eva. Oh.
Hello, Eva. Can you hear us? Can you go ahead?
Will you bring in Lukács?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Loudly.
very well.
Maybe Professor Balibar remembers that he gave me a fantastic
course.
interview
Of course.
a long time ago. But my question is, I came a little bit late to this discussion, and you didn't mention Lukács in this discussion. And I was wondering whether
Shame
in
on you.
like history class consciousness could relate also to your concept of utopia, incorporated somehow in the proletariat.
But do you?
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
I understand.
Okay. So, Etienne, do you want to address these three marvelous points?
Yes. There's no reason why I should have the last word.
Okay.
But it seems to me that in fact all these questions, including perhaps Eva Corredor's reference to the utopian dimension in Lukács's theory of the proletariat, turn around, I would say, one and the same question seen from several angles, which Kendall, I had the impression that I had insisted myself on the on the dimension of practice, and you seem to have heard that I limited the importance of the idea of practice for the sake of identifying places. So, but no, in fact, the central question is the question of practice, of practice or praxis, and the complete system of its articulations, I would say, with temporalities, individualities and collectivities or communities, and institutions, because places are institutions in fact, at least in the Foucauldian description. Now to begin with your reference to Marx and immediately combine that with other perhaps philosophical references. Susan Buckmorse's title is very useful here as a reminder of the fact that both the liberal democratic tradition and the socialist revolutionary tradition put the masses at the center of their reflections on practice and institutions. So when Marx, in his extraordinary description of the class struggle, the only place around the working day in capital, the only place after the Communist Manifesto where he adopts the analogy, he pushes to the extreme, but not with the same conclusions, the analogy between the politics of class struggle and the civil war. And also, very interestingly, one of the places, there are some remarkable analysis of that, where the voices of the proletarians are heard, not just the theory about their conditions and the structure of their alienation, but their voices, and behind the voices or together with the voices are the bodies. There is no doubt about that. If you return to the text, Marx would describe criticize the language of the the mainstream economists who argue that if you grant the limitation of the labor time that the workers are demanding, every possibility of profit and accumulation disappears. And at this point, it's a very dramatic move. He writes in the very text of Das Kapital, and at this point, the voice of the worker from the spinning or the textile factory is heard. That interrupts precisely this discourse, this official discourse. But it is clear also, and right against rights means that, I mean, equal force on both sides, or analogous weights, that what he's concerned with is the leap, I would say, the transition from the individual voice to the mass movement. And the mass movement is the very subject of politics. And now I don't want to enter into a dispute with Eva. I remember our discussions.
Yes.
But Lukács's class consciousness is still relatively close, I would say, in his descriptions to the Marxian problem of the incorporation of many voices into a single mass movement. But the subject object, the universal subject object of history, that's a leap to the philosophy of history. It becomes speculative. And we have, I believe, an interest in this discussion. So of course there is the utopian dimension there is very perceptible and visible, but in the sense of the possibility of already assigning the future, so to speak. So and this transition from, I would say, from the voice to the mass is difficult in every possible manner. It's practically difficult. Of course, it's the work of all the social movements that we know, but it's also where the ambivalences come back, and especially in as much as the mass or the class is not so much perceiving of itself, but called by the theorists and the movement and the leaders, etc., to perceive of itself as a completely isolated or insulated kind of world. Okay. So and then Anne and Kendall turn around, I believe, another aspect of this question. But Anne, allow me to ask, or not to ask a question, but it seems to me that I was perhaps too, in a too hesitant manner, introducing the idea that the concrete utopias rely on a combination of idea and effect. To transform the world, that's an idea, but to change life, that's an effect. It's on that side. So I've read too much of Spinoza to be a complete fan of the idea that in politics affects are everything and intelligence is nothing. So what I believe is interesting is the intelligence of the affects and the possibility to, not to theorize, that's not what I want to say, but to organize, to order and to reorder, perhaps, reorder. And from that point of view, yes, I mean, there's a tendency, and Bloch is very much on that side. All his references to Goethe, to literature. He's very interested in the polarity of the mythic figures. For example, the two Helens, the Egyptian Helen and the Helen of Troy, etc. But he certainly remains very profoundly imbued with the idea that because what utopias try to overcome and teach us, so to speak, or suggest us to leave behind us is a world of misery and pain and labor as an unpleasant activity. So the affect that has to be brought back and associated with utopian thinking and acting is on the side of what Spinoza would call the joyful passions. So pleasure, Fourier is extraordinary from this point of view. And Marx quotes that directly in a utopian passage precisely of his critique of the Gotha program. When the productive forces will have developed sufficiently, and therefore there will be no longer any scarcity, in fact, or social wealth can be redistributed in a sufficient manner, then at this point, labor or work will no longer be something horrible and painful. It will become the first need. So let's.
I'm interested in the structures of feeling, as Raymond Williams would put it, that are emergent for the possibility of ecotopia. It's not that everyone's going to be joyful. It's actually that moment of tension.
No, but what I wanted to say was not that. It was that we seem, if we follow that line, which is probably not yours, we seem to arrive, I would say, at a distribution, if you like, another dichotomy, another binary distribution, in which the effects of anger, indignation, etc., will be on the side of rebellion, insurrections, mobilization against the dominant class, and the effects of pleasure, joy, enjoyment, hope, etc., on the side of inventing a new life and a new practice for our bodies. That's a catastrophic dichotomy, with which we arrive nowhere.
All right, so we have more questions. We have questions that came in from Penelope and others. So we're going to try and put those on, and we'll try and continue the conversation. Maybe have you respond to some of those online, and anyone else who wants to, please email me or Fonda, and we will continue the conversation. Now, Anne, as you were bringing that up, I'll confess that the other option for this year I was thinking about was continuing the project of our dear Lauren Berlant, who, when I was in Chicago, they would create parades of the politically depressed, and we would all parade around downtown Chicago in slippers and bathrobes, literally experiencing the depression. So it was either that. We would have, parades of the politically depressed for 1313 or Utopia 1313. And I went with the latter. But it was marvelous to begin the theoretical foundations or to place the theoretical foundations here, Étienne. We will probably spend more time with some of the theoretical foundations. I'm sure Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad and Shay Gossett will want to talk about that on October 26th, as well as concrete utopias. We might also, Gary, bring in some of your work as well. So, but for now, I think this has been extraordinarily helpful for me to at least set some theoretical grounding for Utopia 1313. And I'll embrace Etienne's 3 points as my theoretical foundations as I go forward now. First, this notion of partiality, right? I'm taken by this notion of partiality. I think thinking in terms of partial concrete utopias may be the way forward. Second, the visibility and this the focus on distribution of resources. You spoke of focusing on war and peace, armament, ways of life, and distribution of resources, mode of interaction with the digital equipment, et cetera. I think I also want to embrace that. And then the third one is, but I would modify it. So it's something about Uterotopia. Okay, so it is the diversity and heterogeneity of these forms of interventions of concrete utopias that I think we need to bring together, and the magicality of both the actions and the spatiality in those spaces. I mean, one of the amazing things about the Foucault's article in Heterotopia is of course the spatiality is so present, but there's also the magicality of the actions performed in those spaces, the way in which, you know, the Persian, also the partiality, also the size and scope and the thimble nature of some of these, like the garden, the Persian garden, but also this idea of where he ends. And so maybe I'll end that with an embrace of the verb and praxis and practices within spatialities. He speaks at the end, of course, about the ship, right? The ship is the heterotopia par excellence. In civilizations without boats, dreams dry up, espionage takes the place of adventure, and the police take the place of pirates. All right, so to conclude, to me, I would say this is my little Uterotopia here with you all and with you, Étienne Balibar, a haven tonight of thinking and community and solidarity and friendship. And so I would call this my Uterotopia of critique and praxis with Étienne Balibar. Thank you so much for kicking us off. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Fondation, for making this all possible, and everyone else, the crew, for working with us this evening, and the Maison Française, and Shawnee and everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And see you in 2 weeks at the Annex. We'll be with Kali Akuno talking about Cooperation Jackson. If you haven't studied Cooperation Jackson yet, get online, look it up, and it's just tremendous interventions going down there. All right, thank you. And thank you, Étienne.